Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Sagalong 2021. This is a 3-year-old BookTube event in which we, a group of BookTubers and myself, read the Icelandic sagas. This great treasure trove of world literature that it can be a little bit strange, maybe a little bit off-putting, despite the fact that many of them are short. We've been delving into them for years now and having a ball doing it. This year we're pursuing a slightly different format. Instead of bouncing all around from whatever saga interests us, we're all reading the same one. We're not reading a short one either. We're reading the longest one, Njal Saga, which is, at heart, in the broadest overview, it is a huge story of revenge, of the teetering courses of revenge. And we've been going through it. It's in many dozens of little sections, some of which are only a few lines long, others of which are a whole scene or even a whole little drama on their own. And this week we're doing sections 81 through 120 of Njal Saga. And I've been going through a bit of drama of my own. In addition to reading the saga again, I've been going through a bit of the drama of my own with translators. I started out with the Magnusson translation for Penguin Classics. And I liked it, but it seemed to me, reading the first 40 sections or so, that the translator was laying too heavy a hand on what he was doing. I'm sure that it's accurate and maybe even really intelligent, but it struck me as coercive as well. I was starting to feel too many times like the jokes weren't landing, or the really withering points to any one little section were completely lost on me. And maybe some of those would be anyway, because this is fairly inscrutable literature, deeply embedded in a society that's 1,000 years old and long gone. But even given that, there are plenty of even older and even stranger literary works that don't feel that way, that didn't consistently give me that feeling. I ordinarily blame that feeling on the translator. So, for the second week, I moved away from that to the Cook translation, and I liked it better. That feeling was significantly decreased, but by then I was curious to know what translators do just in general. So even though I had no major problems with the Cook translation, I still moved on for this week. For 81 to 120, I did George Webb Dasent, a Victorian translator, and therefore smarter and more capable than any translator that comes after him, whose translation came out in 1861 of Njal Saga, the saga of Burnt Njal, and was a hit. It was a hit. It not only sold really well, but it was also a beautiful production. It had a fantastic, long, lively introduction by Dasent. It had great appendices, an enormous index, a whole bunch of help to the reader in terms of what Icelandic sagas are, what the concepts are, what the background is, historical and folkloric, what the vocabulary is, all that sort of stuff. Dasent does. It was a great job. It wasn't just the translation. The translation is fantastic. Once you get accustomed to the Victorian these and thous, the translation is fantastic. In terms of sheer power, and in terms of the translator zeroing in on exactly the right thing that needs conveying to an audience that is not in any way part of the culture that produced the work, he's effortlessly better than Magnusson or Cook. Just effortlessly better in the way that Victorians are. Once you get used to their own diction, they typically embarrass the intellectual endeavors of later eras. So I've had a blast. I've just been having a blast reading. This has been by far the most enjoyable week for me of Njal Saga. So that's the one that I've been dealing with, the George Webb Dasent. And he's the guy who started it all. I don't think there was an English language translation of the whole of Njal Saga before he did his. And I said that his book was a hit, and it was a hit mostly for how great and self-contained it was. Reading it and reading all the stuff around it, all the scholarly work, the supporting work that he poured into it, reminded me of the Fagles translation of the Iliad and Odyssey, with introductions by Bernard Knox and maps and appendices and glossaries and all. There's a reason why those Fagles translations were so popular, and it wasn't just because once Penguin Classics did deluxe editions of them, they were really pretty. It wasn't just that. It was how good they were for the reader who wants to just pick this up and be enthused. And Dasent's translation hit the Victorian literati, the book people of the Victorian era, the people who go to bookstores, the people who haunt their libraries, the people who go to used bookstores, the people who talk about books. It hit that world like a bombshell. And it really triggered the massive interest in Icelandic saga literature that exists to this day. The reason why, for instance, there was a best-selling volume by Penguin Classics, one of their deluxe editions called Sagas of the Icelanders, sold like the dickens for them, was beautiful, and sold like the dickens for them when they put it in their deluxe line. I'm sure that you've seen it. You would certainly recognize it. I'm sure that it's cropped up in your used bookstore. And the only reason that a volume like that exists and is considered commercially viable is because of George Webb Dasent. He's the one who made this possible by breaking this ground, because he fell in love with Nordic literature fairly early in his life and just carried it through for the rest of his time, for the rest of his born days. I'm going to search out the rest of his translations, because his Njal saga, his Saga of Burnt Njal, is wonderful. But the bits that we're reading today, 81 through 120, in one sense continue the threads that we have seen in the earlier weeks that we've been reading. And those threads boil down to two things. The insatiability of revenge cycles. Mark Richardson, in one of his videos, mentioned the classic American touchstone, the Hatfields and the McCoys, where a revenge drama like that spirals out of control. That's what it's made to do. It spirals out of control because families have friends, those friends have friends, everybody has to pick a side, and sooner or later, it envelops everybody. That was one of the themes running through those first 2 weeks of reading, or 3 weeks of reading this book. And the other theme running through our read-along is decidedly anti-21st century, and that is that the people who are keeping these cycles going and really feeding them and egging them on and making sure that people don't come to equitable arrangements, that they don't go to the all thing and make peace, the people who are doing that are the women in this saga. The women in this saga are bad news. They are bad news. They are insatiably aggressive and vindictive. Almost all of them. Insatiably so. I don't know what that says. Probably that's a reflection of the time period in which this was both composed and then centuries later written. But one way or another, it's pretty noticeable. And it, I think, would make a fantastic movie or miniseries or contemporary Madeline Miller style adaptation. If anybody's ever done that for Njal Saga, I've never heard about it. I would love to know that and give it a try, see what people think of it. One way or another, those threads increase enormously in the segments that we're reading this week. They increase enormously. This is the week. These are the segments in which those things go out of control. When the cycle of bloodletting, of just mindlessly retributive vengeance, when that cycle actually enters not just Njal's own personal world, but his own family, where his sons and his stepson, his foster son, are pitted against each other, where the bloodshed is literally at his doorstep, that's when you know that things are completely out of control and therefore untenable. Because one of the threads running through this book is that we, as I mentioned in my earlier videos, there's a lawful society trying to be born here, trying to make itself born. When even the most violent characters kill other characters, sometimes at random, and there are some fantastic killing sprees in the sections that we're reading today. The sections that we're reading today really do underscore why people would love reading this book. In fact, George Webb Dasent puts it in the introduction to his own translation of this work. He says that we may not remember all of the cultural or liturgical elements of the book, but it's excellent heroic literature for boys who yearn to be men, or men who were once boys. That's Georgie Boy sort of leaving out the fact that any women might want to read this, which is odd, because he had to work closely with it to translate it, so he has to know better than most people the active role that women are taking in this saga. But one way or another, the action sequences here are just incredible. That's one of the reasons why I'm a little confused. This has apparently never been adapted to a pop culture, lowbrow, stupid American audience. I don't think it ever has been, except to the extent that you could call, for instance, Peter Jackson's Hobbit movies adaptations of this, where there are fights on ice floes, where there's a character named Thrain, where there's all sorts of picturesque violence and escapes in barrels and all sorts of things. It could be that Jackson was tuning in to Tolkien's own love of these sagas to bring some of that. You will, if somebody were to adapt this to a big multi-million-dollar special effects laden movie with fights on ice floes and a character named Thrain and a whole bunch of other characters like that, people in the audience would say, hey, that reminds me of The Hobbit. But one way or another, those elements run out of control in these segments that we're reading today. It's in these segments that you as a reader realize, okay, something's going to have to happen here, because otherwise literally everyone is going to end up dead. This has just become a mire of uncontrolled vengeance violence, with the law scrambling behind to catch up and find people and whatnot. It's just scrambling behind to catch up. And in that sense, I was really well informed by Magnusson's translation for Penguin Classics. The bit in his introduction about the inadequacies of Icelandic law to keep pace with Icelandic violence were really good. Excuse me. But in these segments that we're reading today, a new element is added to the mix, and it's never a good element to add, and that element is Christianity. Because Christianity comes to Iceland in the form of two-fisted, spear and sword-wielding missionaries, primary among them being a guy named Thangbrand, who is perfectly happy to disembowel you if you won't accept Jesus as your loving Savior. And there he has a couple of great scenes, because this is just a wholesale conversion of a country, and that is a very odd thing. You realize pretty early on that we're not talking about faith here. We're not talking about anything inward. We're talking about, it's purely transactional. One of Thangbrand's earliest scenes is with a character who comes up to him and says, well, how's business? And do you have maybe a god that I can pledge myself to might do better for me than the gods I'm pledged to right now? It has nothing to do with tearing out your heart or, the Hound of Heaven or anything like that. It's purely transactional. And Thangbrand tells him, you might try St. Michael. I'll help you out. And maybe St. Michael will help you out. I thought that was very interesting, because St. Michael is one of Christianity calls itself a monotheism, even though it has a trinity. But in addition to the trinity, Christianity has thousands and thousands and thousands of demigods. They call them saints, but there are thousands and thousands of them. And they're not human. You have to call them something other than human, because they're immortal, they're telepathic, they can affect the real world if you import them correctly. So saints, in any other nomenclature, just because Christianity rules the Western world doesn't mean the nomenclature gets to rewrite reality. Saints are demigods. But St. Michael is one of the comparatively few of those demigods who was not born human. Most of them transform. They're born human, they live a while on Earth, and then they become demigods. But St. Michael was created by God. He is not human, and never was human. He never spent any time as a human. And he's one of the odd exceptions there. And I thought that was pretty interesting, that he would be the inroad, the theological inroad, for people who are already used to gods being gods forever. Odin and Thor and Frey and whatnot, they never had a period as humans. They've been gods forever. They are separate from humanity. They live on a different one of the 9 worlds. But Thangbrand also encounters saucy members of the public who tell him, well, I heard a story that your Jesus was afraid to fight Thor in combat, that he just was afraid to fight him. That sort of thing. That sort of thing was an amusing side note here, as Christianity takes hold in Iceland. And on the one hand, that's bad, because the Nordic gods don't care what you think. And Christianity does. The main god of Christianity is Jesus Christ, and he himself is in the Gospels telling you that the thought is as bad as the deed. He cares about what you think. So on one hand, you're looking at that and thinking, okay, well, the slightly more personally carefree days of Icelandic culture are, unbeknownst to them, they have introduced the viral strain that will end them. So for hundreds and hundreds of years, Icelandic children were innocent. They were free. They might be the whims of the violent adults around them, but they had no inner torment. They didn't fear that they were going to hell. They didn't fear that they were in sin. For hundreds and hundreds of years, they might have had lots of other problems in childhood, but they didn't have that. And now, an ideology has been introduced into Iceland that will give them that will give every subsequent generation of children that, and that's a negative, and that is introduced in these chapters. So on the one hand, you know that, but on the other hand, you know another thing about institutional Christianity, which is that it does not abide chaos. It wants money. It wants property. It wants obedience, suzerainty. Runaway feuds are no good for an imposed Christian state. Now, some of you may say, well, that doesn't seem right because runaway feudal cultures go hand in hand with Christianity. Look at the history of Ireland. You need look no further than that. Although I would stress the Hatfields and the McCoys were church-going people, both of them. And they went to a church that worshiped the same gods, Christian gods. But one way or another, the Christianity here is not when your Christianity is being spread by a barbarian like Thangbrand who will kill you if you don't agree with him, then it's not yet concerned with theological matters. It's mainly concerned with imposing order. But it's another element. It's another checker on the board. And that I found was just fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. I also think, I don't know if it's just that I'm getting more comfortable because the book is getting more violent and I'm basically 8 years old, or whether or not it's something about the book itself. But I got the distinct impression that this book, in addition to getting more and more violent, is getting funnier. As odd as that is. And I've got hints of that from my fellow co-hosts. I'm doting on their videos. Just doting on the videos here. These kinds of group read-alongs are so great. Whether it's the Icelandic sagas or anything else, I wish I got invited to more of them. But most booktubers don't want to invite me to these sorts of things because they hate me, because I smell. Apparently my co-hosts for Sagalong are made of sterner stuff, or maybe they've got clothespins over their noses, but they're okay. They seem to be okay with letting me play along here, and it is fascinating, just fascinating, to get the feel for what the kinds of things that each one of them is picking up on, and then watch the videos and see, what is striking them this time. I hope that these group read-alongs, I hope that I'm invited into more of them because they are a lot of fun. But I think I've noticed that thread in some of them myself this time around, is that a few of my co-hosts have also found these segments to be a little bit funnier in a gruesome kind of way. I mean, there's bloodshed at every turn here. But one way or another, I was introduced to this work at the hands of a charismatic teacher a long time ago. And as a result, I tend to remember more about the charisma than I do about the work. So I'm loving the fact that I'm reading this at a snail's pace with great detail this time around, with other teachers, with teachers who are much more concerned with dialogue than diatribe. That is fantastic. It's a true gift. I remember how this saga ends, but I'm going to go into next week. Next week we overlap. We go outside the bounds of the month of April for the last segment, which will be in the first weekend of May. And I'm hoping that none of my co-hosts are upset about that enough to start a feud. I don't want bloodshed to erupt between the hosts of Sagalong. But I know how the saga ends, but I'm going to be reading it obviously with different eyes for that final week. So join us. I mean, it's too late for you to finish the whole thing, I think, probably in time for next week's videos, but I'm hoping that this read-along has encouraged you to pick this thing up. Its length makes it a little intimidating. A lot of the Icelandic sagas are a lot less intimidating because they're a lot shorter. But I might also make a forlorn plea. I know that it's a little bit of a long shot, but the George Webb Dasent translation of this is free at Project Gutenberg. Maybe give it a try. Just because I love my Victorians, maybe give it a try. And see if you see what I'm talking about, that it is... Magnuson was trying to make a point, I think. A cultural point, a very personal point. I got the distinct impression that he's probably boring at dinner parties. And Cook was not trying to make that point and was being very clear and very conscientious. But only that. Whereas George Webb Dasent, I think, was trying to entertain you. He's trying to show you how entertaining these sagas are, which is exactly what the translator should do. And he's the first one I've encountered that does that. I wonder if you'll think the same if you give it a try. But one way or another, I'm going to wrap this up for now. That is Njal Saga for this time around. We will be finishing up next time for Sagalong 2021, which I consider already to be a massive success. There aren't any other sagas, Icelandic sagas, that are long enough to really occupy us for the whole of a month. So I imagine if we do this in 2022, we'll go back to an a la carte version, but even so, this has been a blast. So I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.